That's the reality right now. Putin is being strangled from every direction. His oil is being seized. His cities are freezing. His puppet states are collapsing. But none of it prepared him for what Beijing just did. And now the one partner Russia thought it still had, the one ally that was supposed to hold the whole thing together, has quietly, deliberately, and decisively pulled out. Abandoned. That word is going to mean something very different by the end of this video, because what China just did to Russia makes that Russian governor's complaint look like a parking ticket. This is the story nobody is fully connecting yet, and once you see how every single piece fits together, the seized tankers, the freezing cities, the collapsing alliances, you will understand that Vladimir Putin is not just losing a war, he is losing everything simultaneously. Let's get into it. To understand why China's move is so catastrophic for Moscow right now, you have to understand the architecture of what Russia has been building for the last decade. Because Putin didn't just start a war in Ukraine on a whim and hope for the best. He constructed what he believed was an unbreakable support system, a financial and military ecosystem designed to outlast any Western sanction, any diplomatic pressure, any economic isolation the United States could throw at him. The blueprint looked like this. Russia sells oil. The oil money funds the war. The war gets sustained by a network of allies: Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, China, each playing a specific role. Venezuela produces the crude. Iran refines it and supplies the drones. Cuba provides the boots on the ground when things get messy. And China was the crown jewel, the silent, powerful, economically enormous partner that gave Russia legitimacy, gave it markets, gave it technology, and above all gave it the quiet confidence that no matter how badly the West squeezed, Beijing had Moscow's back. That was the plan, and for a while it looked like it was working. Russia was evading sanctions through what became known as its shadow fleet, a network of ghost ships sailing under constantly changing flags, transporting sanctioned oil across the world, keeping the cash flowing. That Russian-flagged tanker, the Marinara, formerly the Belawan, had been running from the U.S. Coast Guard for weeks. It was escorted by a Russian submarine, a literal military submarine. Russia thought that would be enough to protect it. It wasn't. The U.S. Coast Guard boarded it anyway, took it over, seized the oil, and sent it straight to American strategic reserves. Think about the message that sends. You've got a Russian military submarine sitting right there, and the Americans still took your ship right in front of it. That's not just a legal action, that's a statement. That's the United States telling Russia, your military means nothing to us out here. And while that was happening at sea, something equally devastating was happening on land, specifically in Russia's own backyard. While the world was watching Ukraine, something remarkable was unfolding inside Russia's borders. The region of Belgorod, one of Russia's most economically productive regions, sitting right on the border with Ukraine, was collapsing, not figuratively, literally. Power plants knocked out, heating systems destroyed, pipes freezing solid inside apartment buildings, temperatures dropping to -15, -20 degrees Celsius, families huddled in the dark, university students filming themselves in winter coats inside classrooms because there's no heat in the building, local bloggers posting desperate updates saying, and I'm quoting directly here, that it is simply impossible to live. Now here's what makes Belgorod so significant to this story. This is not some remote, forgotten corner of Russia. This was a success story, strong industrial base, strategic railway connections, high-paying jobs, good infrastructure by Russian standards, the kind of place that Putin could point to and say, see, life is good under my leadership. And now the governor of that region, a man who was personally appointed by the Kremlin, who owes his entire career to Vladimir Putin, is publicly calling out Moscow. And then he went further. He didn't just describe the problem. He identified the cause. He said publicly that Ukraine is not hitting Belgorod preemptively. Ukraine is hitting Belgorod in direct retaliation every time Russia bombs Kyiv, which means Putin's own war strategy is destroying his own cities and his own people. And then, in what Russian propagandists immediately called an act of treason, the governor said this: abandoned, there's that word again. Russian state propaganda immediately labeled him a traitor, called his statement unacceptable, said it's an act of treason. But here's the thing about that accusation: calling someone a traitor doesn't fix their heating system. It doesn't restore power to a region where the radiators are literally freezing solid, and it absolutely doesn't address the core problem, which is that Putin started a war he cannot contain. That war is now eating Russia alive from the inside. The governor began calling for evacuations. He told families with children to leave as quickly as possible. He told everyone else, if you can go, go. Russian citizens being told to flee Russian cities because of a Russian war. Read that sentence again. And Belgorod is not alone. While Ukraine was dismantling Belgorod's energy grid, it simultaneously began striking energy sites in Bryansk, and then in what might be the most symbolically loaded strike of the entire war, drones hit Sochi, Putin's personal playground, the Black Sea resort city where the Russian elite vacation, where oligarchs keep their yachts, where Putin built his billion-dollar coastal estate. Drone strikes, 3 hours of them, targeting what local footage suggests was a heating facility. The war is no longer over there, it's arrived, and into this pressure cooker, this moment where Russia is financially bleeding from oil sanctions, physically freezing from infrastructure strikes, and politically cracking with officials going off script, walks the bombshell that changes everything. Beijing just cut them off. Here's what you need to understand about the relationship between China and Russia before we get into what just happened, because the Western media spent years warning that Beijing and Moscow were forming an unbreakable axis, that China was the silent engine sustaining Russia's war machine, and that any strategy to stop Putin had to account for Chinese support. And they weren't wrong to say that China was walking a very deliberate tightrope. Publicly, Beijing maintained what it called a position of neutrality. No weapons for Russia, it said, no direct military support, just business, just trade, just economic cooperation between friendly neighbors. But behind that public neutrality was a shadow relationship that Western intelligence agencies tracked with increasing alarm. Dual-use technology, meaning civilian tech that has military applications, was flowing from Chinese companies to Russian defense manufacturers. Microchips, drone components, optical equipment, navigation systems. Not bombs, not tanks, but the building blocks that allowed Russia's war industry to keep producing bombs and tanks even as Western sanctions choked off its access to Western components. Russia knew it, Ukraine knew it, NATO knew it, and for a long time Beijing calculated that it could keep doing this quietly, deniably, profitably without paying any real price, because who was going to stop them? And then Venezuela happened, pull one block out, the whole thing collapses. That's exactly what we're watching happen in real time. When the United States seized those tankers, when it demonstrated that it would physically board Russian adjacent vessels even with a Russian submarine present, it sent a message that landed very differently in Beijing than it did in Moscow. Moscow read it as aggression. Beijing read it as a demonstration of capability and will. Those are two very different things to read, because China is not an emotional actor. China is a strategic one. And what Beijing saw in that tanker seizure was a United States that was no longer passively sanctioning, it was actively enforcing. It was boarding ships, it was seizing assets, it was moving against the shadow infrastructure that the entire anti-Western axis depended on. And the question Beijing had to ask itself was simple. Are we next? India already blinked. The moment Washington made clear that buying Russian oil came with a tariff price tag, that there would be actual economic consequences, India's state-owned refiners started pulling back. Reliance Industries, one of the biggest Russian crude importers on the planet, quietly began reducing its purchases. The message was received without a single shot being fired. China watched that happen, and China has exponentially more exposure to the U.S. economy than India does. China's export economy, the manufacturing base, the technology sector, the consumer goods industry is deeply, structurally dependent on access to American markets. A trade war with the United States is not an inconvenience for China. It is an existential economic threat. So Beijing made a calculation, and that calculation was this: the military and dual-use support flowing to Russia is not worth the risk of becoming the next target of active US enforcement. Not when the U.S. has just demonstrated it will physically seize assets. Not when tariffs are being used as precision economic weapons. Not when the entire shadow network that Russia was relying on, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, is visibly, rapidly disintegrating. Russia needed China more than China needed Russia. Now, according to reports beginning to surface from intelligence and defense circles, Beijing has made its move. The flow of dual-use military technology, the microchips, the drone components, the navigation systems has been significantly curtailed. Chinese companies that were quietly doing business with Russian defense contractors have received pressure from Beijing to step back. The message from Chinese leadership is becoming clear: you're not going to go down with this ship. And for Putin, this is not just a setback. This is potentially the single most damaging development of the entire war. Let's connect all of these threads right now, because separately they are each significant. Together they form something that looks very much like a complete economic and military siege of Russia, and it is happening peacefully, without a single American soldier stepping foot in Ukraine. Thread 1. Oil revenue. Russia's economy runs on oil. Oil is approximately 30% of its GDP. The shadow fleet that was laundering that oil through Venezuela, through Iran, through rogue tankers flying flags of convenience, that network is being actively dismantled. Tankers are being seized. Secondary tariffs are being imposed. On countries like India that purchase the oil, the price of Russian crude has fallen from the 70s and 80s per barrel down to the mid-50s. That's not just a dip, that's a wound. Thread 2. Drone supply. Russia's battlefield strategy in Ukraine has become heavily dependent on Iranian-supplied drones. Those Shah drones that have been targeting Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian power grids, Ukrainian civilians. Iran supplied them, but Iran is itself under increasing pressure. Its own economy is strained, its regional proxies have been taking losses, and its ability to keep the drone pipeline flowing to Russia is diminishing. And now, with China pulling back on the dual-use tech that feeds into drone manufacturing on the Russian side, the production pipeline for replacement systems is getting squeezed from multiple directions simultaneously. Thread 3. Domestic stability. We've already talked about Belgorod, but the significance of that situation cannot be overstated. When a Kremlin-appointed governor publicly says the war is destroying his region and demands that Moscow stop bombing Ukraine, that is not a small thing in Russia. Russia is an authoritarian system built on the premise that the state is strong, that the leadership knows what it's doing, and that the sacrifices of the population are worthwhile. The moment officials start openly questioning that premise, the moment Russian civilians can compare their situation to the footage coming out of Ukraine and realize they are now living parallel lives, the social contract that keeps Putin in power starts to fray. And then there's thread for the China thread, which connects to all of the others, because China wasn't just supplying components. China was the psychological anchor of Putin's entire "we can outlast the West" strategy. As long as Beijing was there, as long as the world's second largest economy was quietly in his corner, Putin could tell his inner circle, tell his military, tell his people that Russia was not alone, that the West's isolation strategy would ultimately fail because the East was with them. That argument just became much harder to make. Now, what does Putin actually do from here? Because cornered animals are dangerous. We've heard that warning, and it's worth taking seriously. A man who is watching his oil money dry up, his cities freeze, his allied network collapse, and his last major strategic partner quietly distance itself, that man might make a desperate move. But here's the other side of that coin. There is an exit ramp. There has always been an exit ramp, and the architecture of the pressure campaign being built right now is specifically designed to make that exit ramp look more attractive than the alternative. The carrot, stop the war in Ukraine, come back to the table, and the world's largest economy, the United States, reopens for business. Russian oil can flow again. Sanctions ease. The isolation ends. Russia's economy, battered but not broken, gets a chance to recover. The stick, keep fighting and watch every pillar of your support structure crumble one by one. Venezuela's gone. Cuba is teetering. Iran is getting squeezed. India is buying less of your oil. Your tankers are getting seized in international waters in front of your own submarines. Your cities are freezing. Your officials are calling for evacuations. And now Beijing has done the unthinkable. The partner you were counting on to outlast Western pressure has decided that self-preservation matters more than solidarity. This is what total strategic isolation looks like. Not a dramatic Hollywood-style siege, but a slow, suffocating, multi-vector compression of every financial, military, and diplomatic resource a country has, until one morning the calculation changes, until the cost of continuing becomes visibly, undeniably greater than the cost of stopping. But here's what makes the China move so significant beyond even the immediate military implications. It signals something about the nature of this entire conflict that Western analysts have struggled to articulate. The countries that aligned with Russia did not do so out of ideological loyalty. They did so out of mutual self-interest. And the moment that self-interest calculus shifts, the moment aligning with Moscow costs more than it's worth, those alliances dissolve quietly, without ceremony, without explanation. China didn't call a press conference. There was no dramatic announcement. That's not how Beijing operates. Instead, the components stop arriving, the meetings get fewer, the phone calls less frequent, the message is delivered in the language of absence rather than words, and in the Kremlin, that silence is being heard very loudly. Right now, that is what they're still saying on Russian state television. Total victory, liquidation of Ukraine as a state, even as their cities freeze, even as their tankers get seized, even as Beijing quietly closes the door. The propaganda hasn't caught up to the reality, and that gap between what Russia's state media is telling its people and what is actually happening to their country, that gap is one of the most dangerous things in this entire situation, because at some point reality always wins. The war came home to Belgorod. The oil money is drying up. The shadow fleet is being dismantled tanker by tanker. The allies are folding, and China, the one partner that was supposed to make Russia untouchable, just made a very quiet, very calculated, very consequential decision. They chose themselves, and in doing so, they may have just ended this war.